militia uniform from the War of 1812. Now the militia came in various types of uniform. You may have seen some guys running around here earlier today in little green hunting frocks. You know, those were specialized riflemen. Some towns where, you know, folks maybe didn't have the ability to get a prescribed uniform, just kind of came in their civilian dress. But generally for Maryland, this was the overall look. You see a broad brim hat, and then what three colors do you see used in combination? We got one color which is?
Red.
One color which is?
White.
One color which is?
Blue.
What color is on the Star Spangled Banner flag? Red, white, and blue. So in this case, the idea was, again, underscoring that national symbol. Even though the American flag flew over buildings and ships, you don't see the soldiers carrying the stars and stripes. Usually they would have carried their regimental flag, which might be yellow or white, depending what they were. And then for these guys, a national flag would be a blue flag with an eagle on it. Or if you look at his drum, a flag like this. You may say, well, that's interesting. They didn't carry the stars and stripes. Well, no. I mean, yeah, they flew it over forts and ships, but they didn't necessarily carry it in there. But as the American flag grew more prominent, later the U.S. Army would. So these are nationalistic motifs, not necessarily the flag itself. And if you're into this era, this early 1800s, the era of Jane Austen, they call it the Federal period, you see these emblems like the eagle on clocks, on the stern of ships. So next time you go to like a historic house museum from this era, look for some of this kind of stuff, like the shield with the U.S. on it or the eagle on it. The militia, basically any man between 18 and 45 had to belong to the militia. He didn't have a choice. So they was used at the discretion of the governor and could be called up. Musicians played a huge role in that. Even in the Battle of Havre here, James Wilmer, who is one of the long eyewitness accounts that we still have, talked about that his unit was formed up to the sound of the drum, and that the citizens were running out of their homes at the sound of the beating of the drums, trying to get the militia to be called out. So the musicians, the field music, were instrumental in that. Thank you. So after the militia ran off, again, well, who were the civilians that came out? And here we have some of the civilians that we have Havre Grace right here. Interesting notes of fashion. So, you know, again, when we talk about the people of Havre Grace, we ought to say the families of Havre Grace, because that's what you're looking at here. And so here, you know, you have a nice family unit right here. The fashions were the high-waisted fashion. That was based off of ancient antiquity. You know, so if you look at statues of Roman women, you see that in ancient times they had that high waistline. The idea was that accentuated the feminine form. And then even in certain catalogs to this day, like Laura Ashley, you still see certain garments inspired by that. The puffy sleeves. So again, if you're into like Jane Austen type novels, this is the era for you. Now the idea is, as we all know, in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, it's an awful lot warmer than it is in England and other countries. So a lot of these dresses were initially somewhat light, fairly thin, and you could almost have the bare arms as well, or slightly covered. But in cold weather, you have the spencer, which is like a short jacket. If you turn around, you'll see, unlike my coat, there are no tails, and the jacket doesn't really come down that long. So they would say, well, why is that called a spencer? Where'd that term spencer come from? Well, there's different theories to that. One is that they're pretty solid, is that a British guy, the Earl of Spencer, is the one who came up with the design. What they're not sure is how he came up with it. He might have come with it, A, because he's just matching the high waistline, but this is probably the most logical, but it's the less cool idea. That it matches the high waistline, so why don't you just have it dovetail with that? One of the other thoughts that it might be that way is that Spencer, after coming back from riding, was trying to warm himself up to the fire and burnt the tails of his coat. And after they were burnt off, he said, hey, wouldn't a short jacket really be neat? And it looked cool on women? And that's how he came up with it. And then another thought that it was a derivative of a short, tight riding jacket that gentlemen wore back at that time. And they're saying, well, hey, if we tailor it a little bit different, It can be a garment for women and help keep their upper body warm on cold days. But essentially the dress and then the spencer. Again, when you talk about cotton, cotton's really important. A lot of the dresses made out of both linen and cotton. Cotton is starting to become more popular, and then of course that sets off a whole different social trend. We talk about slavery and the American South as well. Dyes were really expensive too. The certain dyes like the blue indigo was was an expensive dye to make. So if you think about, we talk about international trade, and it's funny when people say we're in an international economy today. It was an international economy back then as well. Bonnets, keeping your head covered, you know, just like you, I think they got the right way to go. On a hot summer day, they're not going to get sunburned. You might, you know, if you don't put that, you know, suntan lotion on. So you always kept your head covered. But talking about keeping your head covered and international, we have this young lady here, and she's wearing a turban. Dolly Madison, the president's wife. James Madison, President of the United States during the war, his wife, Dolly Madison, loved turban. Turban was a way of being a little bit more exotic, okay? It's a little cooler than a bonnet, man, I'm exotic. Don't forget, years before the War of 1812, remember, the French under Napoleon were running roughshod over Europe. But what a lot of people don't know is they invaded Egypt as well. That's when the Rosetta Stone was discovered. That also gave another plug to all things ancient and Egyptian. And then, of course, in the Middle East, even to this day, people wear turbans. So the fact that the French were in there, that set up a whole craze of doing an Oriental type motif or Middle Eastern type motif. So that's when the French folks started wearing, some of the women started wearing turbans. Then, of course, the British women followed it, and then the American women followed that. So you can see fashion just kind of flows that way. Paul Christensen here, he's like myself, a gentleman of the period. Perhaps the biggest change in fashion that affects us all today actually has more to do with men than women. Like I said, you don't see a lot of women wearing stuff like this today, but you are used to seeing men, if you go to buy a suit, either maybe a dark green, a dark blue, like a navy blue, or a black or a gray. There was a guy, his name was Beau Brummel, and he was kind of like the British fashionista guy. And if he said, well, your suit is out of fashion, sir, and you were like, oh man, he's lame, you know, and everything. And one of the trends from this period was, before this era, if you go back earlier, men could wear bright colors. It was not unusual for a man to wear like a yellow coat, you know, or a big red coat.